All views and opinions expressed in this podcast may lead to learning. All information provided is for educational and developmental purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for a growth mindset. Before taking action, please consult your motivation.
Welcome to Learn Your English podcast, brought to you by Learn Your English.
I mean, a lot of teachers have made this assumption, including parents, that online learning is supplemental to regular class learning. My question to you is, can e-learning become the spine of the system rather than a supplement?
Okay, it's a bit like saying, that using DVDs in the classroom or using YouTube videos in the classroom, that's supplementary. And you could say that using a book is supplementary because the teacher is the main thing. Or is the teacher the supplement and the book the main thing? Or hang on, what's going on here? What is really supplementary? I struggle a bit with the word supplementary.
Teacher Talking Time is created with support from you, our listeners. If you like the show, you like what we do, please subscribe in your favorite app, tell a friend, and leave us a review. Believe us, it goes a long way. If you're interested in contributing to the creation of the show, we also have a tip jar on Patreon. The link to that, all our social media, and our website is in the show notes. For more resources on today's topic, you can check out our podcast page online, learnyourenglish.net/podcast. Thanks for listening. And now, back to the show.
Hi, this is Yuki from Japan. You are listening to Teacher Talking Time, the Learn Your English podcast. こんにちは、ゆきです。Learn Your English podcast, Teacher Talking Time をお聞きください。
Okay, let's get the ball rolling here. We have Fernando Rosell-Aguilar, who is a graduate of the Universitat de Valladolid. Is that how you pronounce that?
That's right, yeah.
Where he got his BA and a postgraduate certificate in education. He then moved on to get his MA from the Open University, and I think you are now finishing your PhD in computer-assisted language learning from the Universitat Politecnica de Valencia.
That's correct, yes.
Also, Fernando is a knowledgeable and experienced higher education learning designer, author, lecturer with a lot of experience delivering blended and online courses. He's been involved in research on learning and teaching for many years. And his research interests, Mike, are online learning. And that's why we have him on the podcast today, with an emphasis on the integration of technologies into teaching and learning. And this includes podcasting as a teaching and learning tool, mobile apps for language learning, Twitter as a tool for teaching and learning, online open and distance learning design, online language learning through CMC learning environments, online information literacy. And you think he's done with that? No, he's got a lot more. He also reviews academic papers for language learning and technology, computers in education, the CALL Journal, the CALICO Journal, and the Journal of Computer Assisted Learning, the JCALL. His research he's also focused a lot on podcasting, and I've included a lot of citations in one of my recent research papers. So, Fernando, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Very honored.
Yes. Well, let's get the ball rolling here. First of all, how has this COVID-19 affected your routine in your life?
Well, it's changed a lot of things. I recently moved from teaching at the university that teaches at a distance and started working at another university that is more traditional in face-to-face teaching. So all of a sudden I find myself back to teaching online because we've moved all our teaching at the university that I'm now to online. So I'm sort of really enjoying being back in the classroom and teaching face to face, and now I'm back in my old domain. But actually, that works for me. I think you'll have spotted that a lot of people have been talking about the shift to online that has been basically pushed by educational institutions onto lecturers and teachers because of this situation. And I'm in the lucky position that I have done this for many years, so it wasn't a scary prospect for me. But a lot of people are sort of having to deal with that now, and you can see why it would be not necessarily scary, but a bit. What's the word I'm looking for? Help me out.
Seamless. It won't be as.
It won't.
No, I just think daunting, a bit daunting.
Oh, it's a bit daunting.
It might be daunting for them.
Okay.
Well, that's quite interesting because you started with the online focus, and now you got, as you said, you got comfortable being in the classroom face to face again. So now going back into this online platform, what have you learned any lessons from this thus far?
I think what I'm, in a way, I haven't, in the sense that what I'm seeing, which sadly we see kind of all over again, is people, colleagues, teachers, being told by their institutions, go ahead and teach online, as if it was something that you could just do, the back of your head, that's something you can just do innately, or because you know how to teach face to face, it's assumed that you can teach online. And also, what I'm seeing is institutions saying to teachers, here's the technology, here are the instructions on how to use the technology, kind of the technical side of it, and not seeing institutions providing pedagogical guidance on what it means to teach online.
I think this is an interesting point because, I mean, we could actually start with this. What is perhaps the main difference between online teaching and face-to-face teaching? I actually got into a couple of conversations throughout the week with people on Twitter, on LinkedIn, saying that, online teaching is very different from face-to-face teaching. I mean, to me, I don't see I mean, of course, there are differences, but if you are a good face-to-face teacher, I think a lot of the pedagogy can be transferred to online teaching. What do you think are the main differences? And what is online teaching? First of all, I think we should start with a definition.
There are many ways that you can teach online. So so far I've been referring to basically synchronous computer-mediated communication through the computer. So this is virtual classes through applications such as Blackboard Collaborate, Big Blue Button, Adobe Connect, those sort of environments where you are in a live situation. You have a number of tools at your disposal, such as sharing presentations, a whiteboard, a text chat, etc. Of course, teaching online has been happening for many years, and before all these tools were available. So teaching online sort of has gone through a shift where right at the start it would have been mostly kind of one directional teaching provided by someone as a web page or content that learners accessed, and it was kind of interaction between the materials on the computer and the learner, and this evolved to interaction between humans through the computer. So online learning can take place in a number of ways, and take many different forms. It could be text, it could be audio, it could be video. Some in the early 2000s and kind of towards until the 2010s, I guess, there was a lot of talk about audiographic conferencing to refer to the affordances of having audio and whiteboards, etc. Maybe not video just yet. So online learning can take many shapes, and you can do that in many ways, and there's many good practices and many not so good practices, just like you find very good materials and not so good materials online and on print.
What are some good examples of good practice and perhaps a few bad examples?
So I think part of it comes from sort of what you aim to do. So some people start with the concept of they talk about transferring your teaching online, as if you could do replication of what you do in the classroom in the online environment. And I don't think you should start from that. I think you should start with your learning outcomes and think about how you are going to achieve those through the online medium. So once you start from there, you don't automatically think, okay, so what's my lesson plan when I normally do this? And let's just try to do the same thing in the online environment. You start thinking, okay, what do I want the learners to achieve in this session, and how do I go about it?
So it sounds like backwards design kind of plays a major role here. Like, as you said, starting with the outcomes and being responsive to those, not necessarily, as you said, transferring.
Yes. So I wouldn't call it backwards design in the sense that I think you should always start with the learning outcomes, no matter what you're doing. So, like when I'm writing books, so I should say, for many years, I worked at a distance learning education university, and as well as online learning, we wrote everything, online materials or DVD-ROMs back in the day, and of course books. And you start with the syllabus and think, okay, what do we want to cover in this course? How are we going to achieve that? And that's where you start. So I think everyone should start from the learning outcomes and plan their teaching based on that.
It's funny you say that, Fernando, because Michael and I were talking about this, and I've been following people on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and teachers are saying, for teaching rather than lecturing or presenting, people are saying that Zoom sucks. A lot of teachers are saying, it's annoying that I cannot do any mingling activities with my students. I can't do the find someone who, but I think what you just said, somewhat addresses those issues. Like, you can't really just think about transferring everything that you do in a face-to-face classroom to online teaching. I think that's where teachers are getting it wrong. Yes. What else are we getting wrong in online teaching?
Let me think.
Please.
Take your time.
One thing actually, okay, so let me start with the technical. Okay. So one thing that I think people sort of, getting it wrong is perhaps too strong, but I think people discover a new tool or are being told to use a new tool, And there's a real temptation to use all the different affordances that tool comes with. So, so take the example of video. A lot of the tools that I mentioned earlier, and you just mentioned Zoom, which is mainly video. So a lot of those tools offer the possibility of everyone having their webcams on, so you can see each other. I basically tell my students to turn their cameras off after the initial kind of waving hello. And a lot of the time I turn my own camera off too. As a tutor, you want the students kind of to focus on whatever you want them to focus on. So if I have a slide or an image or a Word document that I'm sharing with the students, I want them to focus on that and not on whether the room that I'm in is untidy, right, or I have something going on in the background. So that's one example of people kind of using a tool because it's there, rather than thinking actually what's this tool bringing to me.
Right.
And that can happen with a lot of the different tools that you find on these kind of applications. So my advice to people who are new to teaching in these environments would be use what you're comfortable with and use what's going to add to the session. Don't use tools just because they're there. And if you're going to introduce new tools, introduce them in a staggered manner, so you don't overwhelm people who may be new to these environments with lots of different tools that they have to get used to.
Fernando, I'm curious because currently I'm enrolled in university program, and we are moving some courses online. And our professor asked us for feedback in terms of some of the strengths and weaknesses of that move. And a fair few of the students in the class were somewhat critical of the shift, just because they felt that it was removing the social element. And I'm curious if you feel that teachers or your colleagues in general who are now teaching online also feel pressure to maybe use these technical aspects because they want to provide that social experience, or is that just something that again is just a belief we have?
Well, I think it depends on whether you consider the social aspect to be part of what your lessons provide. I don't think socializing is necessarily one of my learning outcomes that I try to achieve, unless it's socializing in the target language, if we're talking about language learning. I think socializing is a byproduct of getting people into a room together, and then they may, they catch up with each other before and hopefully not during the class, and after, and then they go for a drink or something to eat after. So I don't see it as something I need to provide. I think it's a byproduct, like I said. What I have done with my students, so I had a session last week with some of my undergraduate students, and while I was adjusting, I had a problem with my headset, and I had to kind of leave them for a couple of minutes while I did all my testing of volume, etc., which obviously normally I would do beforehand, but I hadn't been able to. And they were super chatty, and I was saying, "Oh wow, you're really chatty." They said, "Well, we miss each other." And I said, "Well, what I've done basically is I've enabled permissions for the students to join to use the software without me being there. So if they want to get together using the software to catch up either socially or work together on an assignment or whatever it may be, they can use it for those purposes, and also for peer support in terms of learning, not only of catching up with breakups and hookups or whatever it may be that they talk about.
That's interesting. I think that's an example of how we can actually allow the tool to do a little bit of what we cannot, but which is not a learning outcome, as you said, Fernando. And I think that's something that teachers really need to bear in mind, is like, what is the learning outcome? And Mike and I, and Andrew, we recently we've designed and presented a series of webinars on pedagogy before technology. I think and you said something about teachers really using technology that they feel comfortable with. I think my question to you is, where should teachers actually start? Should they start with a video conferencing tool? And what would be something else that they could incorporate? So like, basically, what would be the basics or the ABCs of online teaching? What would you recommend?
So I'd say have something. So people don't like looking at a blank screen. I think it's it can be quite.
We don't.
It sounds like my board work in the class.
Well, it's it just, there's nothing to focus your attention. Right. Even if you have just a picture of something, it's just something to look at. So provide. So a lot of people share their, the slides that they may have prepared, and that's something that that everyone's looking at the same thing at the same time. It can support whatever you're saying, and so you can start with having something like that. Audio, obviously, because you're using the you're doing synchronous audio, possibly video. Right. But in terms of what I was saying about the tools is maybe don't poll students or send them to breakout rooms if they don't know how to come back from a breakout room. That kind of thing. Start with the basics of, here's something to look at and I'm going to talk to you, and move on from there. One thing that I think is relevant at this point is that I think it's really important to sort of set the ground rules at the beginning. So so what I normally say is something like, some people prefer to speak, some people prefer to write something on the text chat, if we have a text chat alongside, in your environment. So I say, feel free to ask questions on the chat or to raise your hand if you have a tool that allows the participants to raise their hand to indicate that they want to ask a question or seek clarification of something. So I say, right, I don't mind being interrupted, so feel free to raise your hand or put something on the chat or speak. But some people may not feel that way. So you have to set the ground rules of, okay, I'm not going to look at the chat while I'm talking. I will, after I finish what I'm explaining, then I will look at the chat and look at your responses, etc. Right. So if you set those ground rules and people know what to do, also teach them to use the basics. So it may be that you only have 1 hour online with the students and you think, right, I want to get started straight away with indeed covering one of those learning outcomes that we have for today's session. But it's worth spending a few minutes explaining things like, for example, okay, here's why I prefer you not to have the camera on. And actually, I didn't mention earlier, well, another reason not to have the camera on is that it consumes a lot of bandwidth, and some people have, some people will have better connections than others, and they may, it may lag because of all the cameras being used.
Right.
But going back to to teaching them the basics is okay. So this week I've been teaching using big blue buttons. So I was telling them, right, if you click on your name, you can change your status. Do things like raise your hand, use a few emojis, etc. And I will be looking at that. Or there's the chat, and I will be looking at that. So that's kind of how I think you should start with setting the ground rules, explaining the basics, so you can run the session and they feel comfortable that if they need to say something, raise their hand, etc., they know how to, and then move on to the actual kind of content that you have planned for the session.
Huh.
I think it's funny, like hearing you describe that procedure. I think I'm kind of going through that process on my own, and I'm thinking, wow, there's a lot of language just in that activity alone, isn't there? In terms of how to actions related to a computer, actions of problem solving, and so on.
Yeah, so if it depends kind of if you're teaching in the target language, or with English as a medium of instruction, if it's English you're teaching. So yeah, that's an opportunity to certainly teach kind of the meta language that goes with being in the online environment. I actually back in let me think, 2002, 2003, at the institution where I worked, we were using a piece of software that actually the university had developed because it was a distance learning institution. And it was basically like one of those that I've mentioned before, Adobe Connect, etc. It was called Lyceum, and it had pretty much all the affordances that you expect now from those tools, except video. But we were using it to teach German, French, and Spanish. And one of the first things that we asked the developers was to, depending on which course you were accessing, to change the interface so all the buttons were actually in the target language.
Okay.
It was a relatively simple thing to do because it's just a question of changing the labeling and being able to set the language. But of course, if you're teaching, say, French, and you're saying in French, oh, press the talk button, you don't really want to say the word talk button in English, you want to say it in French. Otherwise, you're kind of mixing a lot of code in there. So that's a relatively easy thing to do, and very useful to maintain the target language as the medium of instructions if you are at the kind of level where you can use a target language as a medium of instruction.
Right. Huh.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, this is, I was just thinking, and this is based on something that you said earlier. I think perhaps it's safe to concede that the education world has been turned upside down after, what's happening in the world right now. And I think the question that everyone is asking is very simple. Will online learning reshape the classroom? And the reason why I'm asking you this is because I have two kids who go to the school board here. And we often, a lot of teachers have made this assumption, including parents, that online learning is supplemental to regular in-class learning. My question to you is, can e-learning become the spine of the system rather than a supplement?
Okay, so the supplementary word.
Yes.
Okay, so basically, I find it somewhat amusing. So basically, you guys read research.
Yeah.
in the introduction and use of technology into teaching, and a huge amount of research into computer-assisted language learning. Somewhere around the conclusion, the summary will say, the technology, we did this, we did that, and conclusion, it will be a great supplement to
right.
teaching.
Yes.
And this applies to apps, to interaction on social media, to podcasting, no matter what paper you're reading, someone says supplementary. It's a bit of a pet peeve of mine. So do tell me to stop, because I could go on.
No, please continue.
So basically, I think it's a bit like, it's a bit like saying that using DVDs in the classroom, or using YouTube videos in the classroom, or actually shouldn't be saying in the classroom, actually saying in teaching, that could be online or offline. That's supplementary. And you could say that using a book is supplementary because the teacher is the main thing, or is the teacher the supplement and the book the main thing? Or hang on, what's going on here? What is really supplementary? I think any good language teacher would be using a number of resources, of types of input, from magazines, books, newspapers, online or physical, videos, audio, and all of it together becomes your session that you're teaching. I struggle a bit with the word supplementary. Now, back to kind of the main focus of your question: is online learning supplementary? Can it become the focus?
Let's take a quick break. We'll be right back.
Professional development has many faces: workshops, webinars, conference presentations. What it shouldn't have is a lack of continuity. Research has shown that professional development initiatives have a lasting impact when they adopt an ongoing approach to professional development and not just a one-off workshop. Through our professional development model, teachers progress along a continuum of development while making connections to their teaching context along the way. As they refine their practice, they enhance their ability to be responsive to the learners and acquire skills which help further learning outcomes. If you're a school seeking an innovative, evidence-based, and bottom-up approach to teacher education in your institute, we'd love to talk to you about how our program works. Contact us online at www.learnyourenglish.com or by email at info@learnyourenglish.com.
Hi everyone, my name is Marek Kiczkowiak and I'm from Poland. You're listening to Teacher Talking Time, the Learn Your English podcast. Cześć, nazywam się Marek Kiczkowiak i jestem z Polski. Słuchacie właśnie Teacher Talking Time, the Learn Your English podcast.
Now, back to kind of the main focus of your question: is online learning supplementary? Can it become the focus? So, as I've mentioned before, I've taught online for many years. I have trained tutors to teach online for many years, and this was in a context where university students were basically being sent materials or given access to materials online, print, whatever it may be, and the interaction time was mostly online. And we have successfully taught languages to people for many, many years using that system. And so to a number of us, actually there's nothing new about teaching online. It's been done, the t-shirt has been collected. Um, so, um, so I realized that a lot of people are new to using this environment, but just because it's new to them doesn't mean that it's new to everyone. And actually, if they look at the kind of things that are being done, they will find that this has been going on for a long time, and they can read on what people have been doing, good strategies, bad strategies. So can it, I think people can be a little bit afraid of the role of technology in teaching. 20 years ago, people were saying, "Oh, is the internet going to replace teachers?" No, the internet hasn't replaced teachers. I think I don't know about your context. I think in the UK, when it comes to contact hours for students, we've probably seen a reduction in the actual time that you have face-to-face with your students in traditional universities. But and hence the rise of flipped learning, etc., where you just basically maximize contact time. So you probably don't read the text altogether in class as you might have done before. You ask students to read the text before the class, so then you can discuss it.
Right.
That kind of thing.
Right.
Would it be, I'm just kind of bouncing this back to you, would it be so awful if the teaching was done online? So as an example, I don't live in the city where I teach, so I have a 1 hour train journey there and a 1 hour back, and of course I have to get there. I try to get there at least an hour beforehand in case there's some delay,
Right.
and also because you want to be ready and everything else. Some of my students also don't live in the place where they're studying, so they have to. So there's a time element and a cost element to getting to your class. And actually, this week I could literally get dressed 5 minutes before my class. I didn't, but I could have.
Or a podcast.
Yeah. So would it be so bad to move some, if not all, of the teaching online? A lot of time would be saved. Maybe there'll be cost saving as well in terms of for the institution, in terms of facilities, having
absolutely.
lights on, all sorts of things. I mean, if I said to you, we're gonna have all our teaching online, would that be so horrible a prospect?
I think your answer actually leads into a broader discussion about accessibility as well, right? Because there are people who are limited in terms of their ability to get out. I mean, not just because of COVID-19, but just in general.
Yeah.
And all the issues and structural issues that universities and schools in general are need to provide so that the classrooms are accessible.
Yeah, and not only physical limitations, but there's also mental health issues, right, where someone may feel really uncomfortable in a classroom or a group situation.
Yes.
And they may feel a lot happier being, in their own kind of the comfort of their own home, and connected to a computer that they connect to every day.
Yeah.
And they're used to using, and that may have assistive software as well.
Right. Yes.
So there's a lot to be said for online learning. There is also another side, just to bring a lighter note, perhaps. I remember years ago, we were doing a Spanish lesson, and one of the students said, how they are normally, they find it difficult to speak in Spanish, and it takes a bit of courage. So she said, well, I'm actually sitting here in my pajamas with a glass of wine, and it's
Right.
working a treat to help me loosen my tongue. So I'm not advocating for the use of alcohol to enhance your
lower your affective filters, right?
That's it.
Yes,
Crashing. We'll have to
exactly.
get Crashing on
Yeah,
podcast to
exactly.
talk about that.
But I think it showed that you were comfortable. You were just at home doing your thing and coming to class.
Yeah.
Sure.
I think there's something to be said, and I don't remember where I read this or if somebody commented on one of my posts recently, but classroom learning favors extroverted people as opposed to introverts who like to learn on their own. They don't like doing pair work. They don't like doing group work. And I find that the classroom, for some reason, they're thrown into this environment where they actually don't feel comfortable. So
That's right.
there's something else to be said about that.
That's an interesting point, Leo, because I think it also maybe reflects something cultural there, right? Mm-hmm. That we're actually prioritizing speech, right? We're prioritizing, as Fernando said, the confident student who feels confident to speak in front of others and can take over the class. And oftentimes, like, definitely, and I don't want to speak for all teachers out there, but just as something to be reflective about, right? Like how, when we think about grading a class and grading participation, let's say, let's be honest, like I think that we do put a lot of importance, place a lot of value on one's participation and their ability to generate discussion over, say, silent reflection. And
I think there's a lot of issues that cannot come together in that. First of all, is kind of where we're starting from the assumption that a kind of socio-constructivist approach to teaching is the best way. I think we can all kind of agree that it's the approach that we're kind of living in these times.
Right.
And that students then co-learn, and you ask them to discuss something and come up with their own ideas of why that is or how that works or whatever it may be, and then discuss it all together, and that's a good way of learning. In other times, a behavioristic approach wouldn't have done that, or a constructivist that wasn't social constructivist approach wouldn't have encouraged that. So you are starting from those kind of from that perspective as kind of the good way, which we could argue about, but let's not particularly. But I think there's also an element of a very Western approach to teaching.
That's what I was coming at. Yeah.
So I teach a lot of international students who, particularly when it comes to content teaching, I think with language, everyone understands that they have to have conversations, they have to talk to one another, they have to do that in the target language. When it comes to teaching content, I think a lot of students from certain countries where they have been taught in a way that reflects other ideas about teaching, where the teacher is kind of the source of all information, the sage on the stage,
right?
And they're supposed to listen and take notes, and their opinion is considered irrelevant and certainly not asked for. I think you then have to take into account those kind of beliefs about learning that the student may have grown up with and believe in.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely a lot of interesting parallels here. I was even just to circle back to something that you said earlier, and I think this is something that we as a company believe in, is that the teacher is not really required. It's not really essential for learning to take place. We believe that if students are motivated, if students have sufficient input, and if they are using the language, then I mean, how many people have learned languages without the help of a teacher? And I think the biggest problem we're encountering with online education now is that teachers are still under the, not everyone, of course, but teachers still think that they are necessary in order for learning to take place, perhaps. I don't know what
Yes, I think you make a very good point there. I think that depends a lot on the context in which the language is being learned. So first of all, obviously, if you are physically located in a place where the target language is the language that is spoken, there's a lot of difference there. Certainly, learners can have many opportunities for interaction, for exchange, for accessing target language, etc. But aside from that, I think I'm a big advocate of autonomous language learning, and lifelong learning, where you enable your students, your learners, to go out and do their thing, basically, and continue without the need for a teacher.
Right.
However, if you're talking about a school or university setting, an educational institution of any sort, there is an expectation that you are being taught and assessed, and because you are being taught, that teaching comes from the institution. Some of it may be through something as basic as going to the library and getting a resource, to online delivery of educational resources and contact time with a teacher. So I think it's an expectation in that kind of situation that, yes, a teacher will provide, will be the main conductor of that teaching process, whether they are the main, so when you the main source, so an online in university course normally would assume it's something like 300 hours in one semester. You're not going to have 300 hours of contact time with the teacher and the rest of your fellow students. So there is an assumption that a lot of that will be independent work, be it doing homework, revising for exams, writing assignments, whatever it may be. So I wanted to kind of make the difference between people who are actually registered on a course and people who are learning independently. So autonomous learners are autonomous learning keeps growing, and I think it grows more and more the more that is available online. So you take apps, for example, when it comes to language learning, people see the likes of Duolingo, Busuu, Mango, all these language learning apps, and they teach themselves, or they start working through them to learn a language. And most of the time, this is not teacher-initiated activity. It's not something that someone's told them to do. It's something that they do autonomously. So more and more, we're seeing the availability of services such as that, and people, I did a study of people using a particular app, and one of the questions was, do you think you can learn a language just by using the app? And a number of the respondents did think that they could just learn the language using the app. They didn't see it as supplementary. So I think there is the more that people see these assets or services being used, the more that they believe that actually you can learn those things. I think the more people use their mobile devices to engage in learning, the more they believe that you can actually learn through those mobile devices, and therefore are more likely to try to learn using the devices.
Mm-hmm.
But you could be very keen and can go in the complete opposite direction to where you should be going. So it's fantastic that people learn autonomously and self-direct their learning, but they also need, and this is something that is not generally being taught to language learners, is learn to manage their learning, not only in terms of time that they should put in, etc., but also in terms of, okay, so if you're going to learn, you decide you want to learn a language, what are your goals? And maybe look at something like, I know in Canada and the States, this is not as commonly used, but I think the use is growing. Are you familiar with I'm sure you guys are familiar with the Council of Europe Framework of Reference?
Yes.
For levels of language learning. So, if you look at a simplified version of that, it'll tell you that, you be competent in a number of situations, and also that this involves, writing, speaking, reading and listening, interaction, and grammar and vocabulary involved in that as well. So some apps will test your vocabulary to the end of time, and not actually teach you a lot of reading, because they usually display very short sentences on the screen.
Right.
So you need to, I think, as language learners, and if we're going to enable learners to work autonomously, we need to make them realize that they need to come up with a plan, make sure that they're balancing the different skills that they need to learn, and not just using one source for learning that maybe focuses on one particular skill, but actually making sure that they're covering all the different skills.
Oof. Mike, do you want to take over now? Because I have a lot.
Well, yeah, no, because what I'm hearing is that there's a real opportunity for students to become more invested in learning, and I think that this sudden shift actually represents a great opportunity for students to kind of discover language through their own curiosity, right? Yeah.
I was even thinking that this time away from school, especially I'm looking at my kids in particular, it's actually a golden opportunity for children, for learners, to research their interests and actually share them with not only with their parents, but with their peers. So kind of like almost like online education that fits each child. My question then is, if students are feeling empowered, and again, going back to teaching, Fernando and Mike, is teaching should facilitate learning. We should never come from this assumption that teaching leads to learning. And this is why, Fernando, we believe in teaching students how to learn, giving them transferable skills so they can actually go out there in the world and actually do things, as opposed to, here's a reading text, here's a list of comprehension questions. I mean, when was the last time you were given a list of comprehension questions when you were listening to the news, right?
Not quite.
So
although maybe some people should.
That's true.
Sorry.
That's true.
But that's an aside.
Let's not judge. Yes.
Yes. Sorry about that. If it was
but my point is, could this idea of individualized instruction, could this actually accelerate learning?
I think the more you personalize learning, the more the learner will see the benefit of engaging with it. So it's the kind of thing where, I always say so if learners have to, I don't know, make a presentation about something, I try to make the topic as free as possible. When it comes to reading, I do something that some of my colleagues have sometimes found a bit controversial. So for beginners, well, not quite beginners, but maybe intermediate
False
learners.
beginners or low
Yeah.
level.
So I people come to you and say, "Oh, what kind of things should I be reading?" And traditionally, well, I was learning English. It was the classics. And from Shakespeare, which is not the most
transferable
of things,
Yeah.
to I don't know, Dickens, whatever it may be.
Right.
And I always say, actually, if you're the kind of person that doesn't tend to read novels, for example, and you read National Geographic, then go and find National Geographic in the target language.
Right.
If you read Hello Magazine, go and find Hello Magazine. A gossip magazine or whatever it may be. Fit it to the kind of things that you would learn and that you would be interested in reading. So another thing that I say, particularly when it comes to reading, is actually, so when you pick up a book in a foreign language and it's one of the first books you read, unless it's a graded text where it's been simplified for you, etc., it's quite a challenge. So I actually, and some people do disagree with me, and feel free to disagree with me. I actually say to students, "What's your favorite book?" And if I'm teaching Spanish, which is what I normally teach, but I've taught some other languages, I say, "Well, go and pick up the Spanish translation of that book."
Right.
And why? So I tell my students to read Harry Potter in Spanish. Why? Because they are familiar with the plot. And therefore, they are reading without this fear of, if I don't understand the word, I'm not going to know what's going on. Well, actually, you know exactly what's going on. So it doesn't really matter, and you're enjoying the language a bit more. You're not stressing while you read. Also, a lot of words will be very similar. So taking the example of Harry Potter again, you have Muggle or Hufflepuff or Gryffindor or Hogwarts, and those are going to be pretty much the same. And actually, it's super fun to see how those are translated, because some terms are translated and some aren't. French in particular, actually in the Italian version as well. I don't ask me why, but I've read the first Harry Potter book in English, in Spanish, in French, and in Italian, and it's hilarious the way some of the things are translated, and the words, the names of the characters, some are translated, some are not, and it's fun. It's fun to read and see what's changed and what's different. Sorry, I've kind of digressed. But my point is, going back to individualized learning, is if you like reading Harry Potter, read Harry Potter. If you like watching YouTube videos about whatever it may be, find those in the language you're learning. The more individualized the learning experience is, the more it relates to what you're interested in, the more motivated you're going to be, the more you're going to be interested in learning the vocabulary that relates to those fields, because it's the language you speak with your peers or with your friends, and that's the language that you are going to want to speak with people in another language. It's what interests you.
Let's take a quick break. We'll be right back.
Quality professional development is such an important part of the teaching industry, but it's surprisingly hard to come by. That's why I was so pleased to come across Learn Your English, a company providing online teacher education courses with a fresh perspective. My name is Erin, and I'm an English language teacher. After a decade in the classroom, I found myself teaching the same things in the same way. My learning seemed to have plateaued. I wanted to take charge of my learning, and I really like how the online Learn Your English courses don't prescribe anything. They motivate me to reflect on my teaching and propose tactics and ideas I hadn't considered. If you're a language teacher wanting to learn inside your busy schedule, I highly recommend their online courses on Thinkific. Head on over to lyenetwork.thinkific.com. That's lyenetwork.thinkific.com. Take control of your education. You won't regret it.
Hello, my name is Victor. I'm from Huskvarna in Sweden. You're listening to Teacher Talking Time, the Learn Your English podcast. Hej, jag heter Victor. Jag kommer från Huskvarna i Sverige. Du lyssnar på Teacher Talking Time, din lära dig engelska podcast.
Because it's the language you speak with your peers or with your friends, and that's the language that you are going to want to speak with people in another language. It's what interests you.
Yeah, and you have that purpose, right? Even going back to the CEFR can-do statements, right? It's a little bit like creating your own can-do statements. Absolutely. I can go to the pub and chat about Harry Potter now because I've read it in English, and I have some of that vocabulary at my disposal, right?
Yeah. I was just going to say, what I was going to say is that it's basically learning that fits your lifestyle. And I think we seem to forget that. We seem to, for some reason, I don't know, there's so many assumptions that we make about our learners, but we seemingly forget that they're humans and they have their own interests and their own desires. And like you said, Mike, purpose. And as you said as well, Fernando, is like, what are you interested in? Like my children, like my son, all of a sudden, he just wants to learn about Bill Gates. So I said, why don't you just learn about Bill Gates then? My daughter is learning more about science. She's like, I really want to learn more about what are phones doing? Like, why are people so addicted to phones? But we don't talk about these things in my class, Daddy. And I said, well, then just learn. I'm not going to impose my own agenda on my children. I want them to find, and this is why I was asking, like, could actually this accelerate learning? I agree with you, Fernando. I think it could definitely accelerate learning. And perhaps this is what we were getting wrong in education. I don't know.
Well, I think there's a big stumbling block along the way, a huge barrier, which is that a lot of formal education comes with a syllabus,
right?
And that syllabus was designed by whoever, and
no comments on the syllabus designer,
and however
and however, yes, and you are responsible for your students achieving the learning outcomes of that syllabus. So where you can, by all means, individualized learning, but let's not be naive that we can just tell our students to look into only what they're interested in. Because you have to, complete this, follow the syllabus.
Right.
Also because, we have a duty to provide a general education where you assume there's a number of things that everyone knows. So, it's like everything, syllabi are a blessing and a curse. They guide your learning. You don't have to start from scratch, but also you get some things enforced. I think it's particularly oppressive at higher levels of language learning, particularly when they say, that you have to read Dickens, something like that. And you think, and how is Dickens relevant to the kind of learners that I've got at the moment? And it can be quite a challenge to make that interesting, particularly because you may be the first one that's not interested.
Yeah. It's tough to balance, though, isn't it? Right?
Yeah, it's a hard thing to balance. And this is why, kind of taking it back, you should use the opportunities for independent learning. You should foster the independent learning to be as personalized as possible, because some things you can control, some things you can't control. So I should clarify, when I talk about autonomous learning, I'm talking about things that students do kind of out of their own bat to learn for themselves, etc. When I talk about independent learning, I'm kind of talking about work they do towards something, probably like not necessarily homework, because you've said that, but work that they do towards increasing their exposure to the language or their knowledge of whatever point in language, but probably within being kind of registered in some kind of formal tuition sort of work.
So Fernando, basically then we have autonomous learning and we have independent learning. So what is the goal of the teacher in your perspective in the classroom? Is it more to actually teach students how to actually learn outside the classroom? My question to you is, how much teaching should we be doing online?
So, good question. I am all for teaching kind of lifelong skills and skills that are useful in the workplace as well.
For example?
Well, it's things like, doing a presentation, agreeing something online, working as a group, those kind of employability skills that an employer is going to assume you have because you've been to university, in the case of university or at school. So you've learned, it's our job not only to teach learners or students the content of our subject, but also a number of skills that go with it. And that could be, for a postgraduate student, it might be, being able to locate sources and use as a referencing system. People are going to assume that a postgraduate student knows how to do that, even if it's not something that is taught in your specific class, because you're teaching X subject, but those are some of the skills that they have to pick up along the way, even if they're not, explicitly taught. So I do think that there's a lot of teaching that needs to happen and that is never in the syllabus about learning to learn. Good strategies for language learning. What works, what doesn't work, what works for some people, but not for others. We
don't think about that.
Yeah. And also, there's some myths to be kind of dispelled. One that is particularly annoying is the apart from learning styles, which has been fairly debunked by now. It's the whole a younger, the whole digital native nonsense, which, just because someone is younger, they know how to use technology. No. That's been very much debunked. But mainly what people seem to miss when they have that assumption is that just because someone knows how to use the technology doesn't mean that they know how to use it for learning.
Right. That's very interesting.
And that is the key.
Actually, I'm sorry, please. Yes.
Yeah. Go on.
No, because I'm quite curious, because now we're getting on the topic of students, and I think a lot of teachers, and perhaps this is a myth, kind of perceive that students who study online are different from those who study face to face. In other words, that they're different types of students. And I don't know, could you comment on that? Because I think you've written about that, right? That the similarities and differences between online students versus face to face students.
Yeah. Yes, I did do some research on that a while ago. I think there was a difference because it used to be the case that people taking online courses had chosen the online version of the course. I think nowadays you don't really find that choice. So
it's live that they want, is what you're saying, maybe.
Yeah, it's online learning is now something that is kind of assumed is going to happen in many places. Places that where it wasn't assumed are now moving their teaching online for all the circumstances going on at the moment, as well as the natural evolution that was happening to moving towards online teaching. So you should always assume, you should never assume rather, that the online learner that the online learner has chosen to be an online learner.
Okay.
But within that parameter, I think the proficient online learner is probably one who is not afraid of the tool or of the medium of delivery, who doesn't have a kind of a mental block of, online learning is supplementary or not as good as.
The S word, let's call that the S word from now on.
That this is just not as good as. I think anyone who starts from that position is a lot more likely to find the faults, to find to compare it to face-to-face teaching, not in terms of the experience, but in terms of the outcomes. So we started right at the beginning with the learning outcomes should be the focus point.
Right.
I think someone who is predisposed to think that online learning and teaching is not the same or is inferior, in fact, because it is not the same. It's a different thing.
Yes.
But that somehow it's inferior, then are going to find the faults, and they're going to be the ones thinking, well, this is not good enough, etc.
Right.
So, and that applies also to teachers.
I was about to get to that because I have to ask you a question about that, because a lot of I think there was a survey 2017 2018, I can't remember, saying that about 9% of academics prefer to teach in a completely online environment. That basically means 91% of us don't. And I suspect, I would argue that a good majority of the 91% would prefer to teach anywhere but online. So my question for you, Fernando, is, I think that good teaching is good teaching regardless. If you are a good teacher face-to-face, you're going to be a very good teacher online. So my question to you is, why are teachers so resistant to online teaching?
I think a lot of teachers haven't experienced online teaching. I think a lot of teachers haven't been trained to use online teaching. And if they've been trained on how to use the tool, but not on the pedagogy of online teaching.
Right.
So it can be daunting, and it can be scary for some people.
Absolutely.
Some people may have the belief that their teaching will not be good enough because they don't think the medium is good enough. And that happens because they've not actually received any tuition online that they've been, at all. And therefore they don't have a good experience of what teaching online is. Or they may have had an experience 10 years ago with a very different kind of technology, that different affordances, and who knows, maybe with a not very good teacher. That's why when I teach teachers to teach online, I do that online. So that, we do it in the environment, and they get the experience of receiving tuition online. They know what it's like to be on the other side when there's confusion, etc.
Right.
Also, people tend to make a huge deal of the fact that the first 5 minutes of a class will be spent going, can you hear me? Can you turn up your mic? The kind of thing. But actually, when you go into a face-to-face session, you may well spend 5 minutes going, can you sit down? Can you get your things? Can you, all the kind of stuff that happens. But because, they're having to do this kind of techie stuff, then it affects their own beliefs about online learning. I think they're also very there's two more things. So one is they may not be very comfortable with the tool, and I want to talk about the roles of the online teacher in a minute. So they may not be comfortable with all the roles that they have to play as an online teacher. And also, for those who are very experienced face-to-face teachers, it's like treading the boards. The more the more you've done it, the more comfortable you're with it. And someone who is very used to being comfortable, to knowing what they're doing, how they're doing it, if there's a problem, they've solved it before in most cases, so they know they have that backup of things they've done in the past that have worked. When you're in a new environment, you feel more exposed. Many teachers also have this belief, because of this so-called digital natives that don't exist, but they think, I've had conversations with teachers say, but the students more know about technology than I do. And my response to that tends to be, A, that's probably not true. And B, will use that. So if someone's having a technical problem, rather than thinking that it's up to you to fix it, why don't you say, does anyone know how to fix that? And actually use it for your advantage. Does that answer your question?
It does.
Yeah, I just had it because I think related to that, and I'd love your expertise on this, because you've worked, as you said, you've worked with teaching teachers, and I wonder if there's been a particular stage of a lesson. You mentioned the beginning of a lesson earlier. I wonder if there's a particular stage that teachers tend to struggle with when they move from the online, from the face-to-face classroom to the online environment. To give you an example, do they struggle with like the kind of practice stage, or in the way that they give feedback? Are there certain things that they have a harder time realigning or adapting?
Yeah, I mean, you are sort of coming from the perspective of the transferal of what they would normally do face-to-face to the online environment.
That's right. Yeah.
But it is what most teachers will actually try to do. So it's more than fair enough. Actually, I'm going to pick up the point that I was sort of making earlier about the roles of the teacher, because this comes in, I think this is very related to your question. So as face-to-face teachers, we know our role, we know what's expected of us, we know our expertise. When you're teaching online, you have other dimensions that come with the role. So first of all, suddenly you are the IT help desk, and you may not feel comfortable in that role at all. Okay. You are also so you are kind of the facilitator of and the convener of this thing, and you also kind of, as you always do, you kind of group students and arrange them, etc. There's also suddenly you are in a very multimodal environment where you may have a PowerPoint slide in front of you. You have a list of participants, and some people may be appearing and disappearing from that list, and you don't know why. You have a text chat going on that you have to keep an eye on. You are looking at your lesson plan, and you're listening to the students and reading what they're writing. And, a multimodal environment can be quite challenging for those that are not experienced. So, the more you do it, the more you get used to it, the more you can say, you suddenly think, okay, for the next 5 minutes, I'm not going to be looking at the chat because we're focusing on this, and then I'll catch up with the chat later.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you were saying about the stage where it might be kind of more difficult. I think group work, people tend to think that, group work is such a challenge in online environments. And it actually isn't. So normally, a few of the software packages that we mentioned earlier have breakout rooms, they're normally called. So you can assign either randomly or literally the ones you want into groups. So last week, for example, I was saying to my students, okay, I want you to discuss this among yourselves and then come back and we'll see what you've talked about. The kind of thing that you would do in a face-to-face classroom. And so I assigned them to rooms, and off they went. So at that point, in most of these environments, you can't hear what's going on because everyone's in a different room, or in groups of 3 or 4, whatever it may be. And you physically have to go, not physically, but
yes.
But as you would kind of as you would in a classroom situation where you kind of hover around people working in groups and kind of eavesdrop a bit and see that they're going, and check with them, you know what you're doing, any questions, that kind of thing. But you do that. You basically click into each group and have a quick listen and ask any questions. Are you sure what you're doing? Blah blah. And that for some people it's a bit cumbersome. You also need this is something that we haven't discussed. What we haven't mentioned is giving instructions in the online environment needs to be perfected, and it's not going to happen the first time you try it. So you're used to saying, okay, well, I want you to work in groups, and people start getting into groups and saying, no, listen to me. And it goes something like, okay, I'm going to put you into a breakout room, and I'm going to set a timer. So at the end of the 5, for example, minutes, you will be recalled automatically into the plenary session, into the plenary area rather than the breakout room. You will be working. So this is what you have to do. Discuss this, talk about that, and at the end of the 5 minutes, you need to have 3 ideas about blah blah blah.
So very clear.
Your instructions need to be very precise. What I tend to do is, depending on the software, you can actually preload slides onto the breakout rooms. And in some other software, whatever slide is on the main screen automatically gets displayed in the breakout room. So I normally have very precise instructions in bullet points on a slide that basically goes with the students to the breakout room, so they have something to focus on, and also the instructions very clearly.
Interesting. Perhaps, Fernando, one thing teachers could do is have as you said, slides, or perhaps even a Google Doc.
Yeah, of course.
Right. I wanted to say, because you were talking about the roles of an effective online teacher, and I think this one, for me, it comes from a place of vulnerability, which Mike and I talk a lot about this. Teachers need to be vulnerable. And I think one of the roles of an effective online teacher is that you are a co-learner. Great teachers are lifelong learners. And I mean, they can model that learning for their students in a variety of ways in the online classroom. You can, like as you said, you can be very active, but not too active, right? So you will silence students. You're participating in those online discussions. You're sharing what they're learning about their subject. But at the same time, you're just learning with them, right?
Yes. And I think people, some teachers kind of feel quite, I think vulnerable is a good word you just used. I think people think that they should be perfect, and that their students expect them to be perfect. I'm very upfront with learners, and I will say, okay, I've taught online many times, but actually this piece of software that we're using today, I've only used a couple of times. So there will be times when I'm not entirely sure which button I have to press, or you may know, and I may say to you, do you guys know where that button is, or whatever it may be? And if you are upfront, and if you say to them, oh, I didn't know that, if someone uses something that you didn't know was there, let them know that you are also learning with them. So not only are you a co-learner, but make that explicit.
Yes.
Because
some
there
humility.
is absolutely no shame in not knowing every single button of every single piece of software.
Yeah. I think teachers, for some reason, make this assumption, right? Yeah, that we always need to know everything.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Mike,
I
any?
think.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. It's. I think we put that pressure on ourselves. We want to be perfect. We are kind of center stage,
Yes.
and we want to know our lines on the particular play that we're starring in.
Yeah.
We want to make sure
Yes.
that we know our lines and we're, stage left and everything else. You want to make sure that everything's working. It's kind of a professional pride. And while I think I've had teachers who I'm the kind of teacher that if someone asks me a question about my topic and I'm not actually entirely sure, I will say, actually, I'm going to have to look that up and we can talk about it later or next session. Some people are never ever do that kind of thing because they just feel like students are going to think less of them, or they expect them to be all knowledgeable. So it kind of depends a lot on your attitude to what being a teacher is, and that you're sometimes just a facilitator of learning and not the source of support.
It's what we like to say, moving away from being the sage on the stage to the
Indeed.
wise on the side.
Yeah.
Yes. Or the guide on the side.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Michael, you have any? We're reaching the end of the podcast. We've been talking for over an hour now.
I don't know how that happened. I'm sorry. I go on.
No, it's
it's great.
It's really, really interesting.
I'm really
Leo,
enjoying it.
Yeah, I just I guess I would go. I'm trying to think back in terms of what came up in our webinars and what have I seen kind of in the social media chats. I think there's a lot of concern about feedback. Like you mentioned breakout rooms, and I think that as you said, it depends on the teacher, I guess, and their own idea in terms of how they approach discussions in their classroom and how strictly they monitor and how they choose to give feedback. But I'm curious, are there any kind of best practices that come to mind in terms of giving feedback and managing breakout rooms in particular?
It depends kind of on your beliefs about feedback and how you do it, as a teacher, personally. I mean, in terms of feedback, I've done it in a number of ways. So if a group has just done a presentation, say, then you want to give your feedback straight away, or you may, but if people have been, talking and we were practicing this and that, I may leave 5 minutes at the end and say, right, I've noticed a few of you made this mistake, or I keep hearing this expression being used in this way and it's more accurate that way. I'm going to do a generic feedback. I mean, I don't think anyone does individualized feedback in the group situation. That could be embarrassing for the individual. What I do is offer a session, like a drop-in session. Like literally, I'm going to be
like an office hour type of thing.
Yeah, literally, but online. And say, okay, you just pop in and we can talk about your piece of work if you want individualized feedback. What I also do, so my students just, I just returned the marks for one of their assignments. And obviously, I wrote a lot on each individual assignment, feedback to the student of why they got the mark, or, misspellings, whatever it may be, all the sorts of things that you would feedback on. But I also did a PowerPoint where I took the slides that I used to present the coursework. So this is what you have to do. This is what, this is what you're going to be assessed on, and just basically went back to those slides and went, okay, so this is what you were asked to do. Some of you haven't done this. So what I do is, you know that PowerPoint has a record audio option.
Yes.
But some people don't know about that. You can do like a narration. So you literally, with each slide on what they were asked to do, I say, right, so some of you have, and I try to be positive with the generic feedback for everyone. So I say, most of you have achieved this very well, if they have. Some of you missed out on this and this and that, so pay attention to that. So you were asked to reference using the Harvard referencing system. So some of you, because you've been reading papers that didn't use the Harvard referencing system, you've copied that referencing system, and actually it's not accurate for this particular one. Right. Or a lot of you, I noticed your paragraphs where didn't stick to a single idea, or didn't have the right introductions, or whatever it may be. So I record a generic feedback that applies to the whole cohort to help them improve their assignments for the next one, and just upload that so they can access it.
Okay.
Right.
Huh. It's funny, Mike. I was just thinking about that. I think just what Fernando just said, I think it goes back to the beginning of the podcast. We need to have very clear learning outcomes. That's it. Yeah. I mean, we're reaching the end of of the podcast here. And I wanted to wrap this up with perhaps a statement that will probably lead to a question, Fernando, and I hope this is going to be the last one because we don't want to take up too much of your time.
Thank you. You've been gracious.
But I think the fact of the matter is most of us don't know how to teach online or how to get better at it. But the people that our tribe, these people, these educators, they are motivated to learn, which brings me to my question. How can teachers become better at online teaching? How can they develop?
Okay, so I think it's we can't generalize all teachers in all situations. So I think there's a number of things. First of all, familiarize yourself with the technology that you will be using. If you're not afraid of the technology, you will be a lot more comfortable in your teaching and feel less apprehensive about teaching in that environment. Right. Think of the roles you are having to play in the online environment, and which ones you're comfortable with and which ones you're not. And the ones you're not, and it could be, like I said, becoming the IP help desk.
Right.
If you don't know, just say to students, I'm sorry, I don't know this. Can one of your classmates do it? Does anyone know? And if they don't, just say, there are times that you're teaching online and suddenly someone's having a sound issue or whatever it may be. And some people will spend 10 minutes trying to fix that student's technical issue.
Right.
Now, during those 10 minutes, you have a whole lot of other people in the session that don't have that problem and are thinking, how is this relevant to me? You have to let them go at some point. So just literally say, okay, I'm sorry, this is not something that I can cope with. I know it's frustrating for you and it is for me, but I can't help you anymore and we need to get on with the lesson. I suggest that you contact whatever help desk is available to them through the institution or whatever it may be, and join the next session or watch the recording if you're recording your session.
Right.
So that's something else. Most of all, I'd say get together with, if you're in a situation where a whole lot of you have been told, go teach online, and this is not something you're experienced in, go and find recordings by more experienced teachers that may be available online.
Right.
And also get together with your peers, your teachers, that your colleagues, and have a few tryout sessions. You can do something like, okay, for example, my students are having to present something online as part of their next assignment, and my next class is going to be, I've asked them to come up with a very short learning object that they're going to teach the rest of the class. So each of them will have a turn at teaching that for 2, 3, 5 minutes.
That's a good idea.
And it's just, okay, do that. Get your peers together and, have an hour session where each of you is going to manage the classroom for a bit, the session for a bit, and try new things. So the other thing that I've told my students is, I don't want all of you to base your activity on X, Y, and Z, the most obvious tools. So why don't a couple of you meet online using the software, plan something, maybe using breakout rooms, maybe using some of the poll tool, whatever it may be, and let's all experience the different tools. But the onus of knowing it all doesn't go to one person, but you divide the work, say, okay, for today's session, we're going to do this. Don't expect to be familiar with all of the tools from the first session. Try them out at a time that is, you're not overwhelming yourself or the students. Try things out because they will be, or don't try things out because you've already got the tools that you need, and that are the ones that are going to be more conducive to you achieving the learning outcomes for your session with your learners.
Right. Wow, that's a great, very handy list.
Well, Fernando, we would like to thank you for your time. And
it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, no, seriously. Mike, any final comments?
No, I learned so much, and I think the way that everything was delivered, I think it's something that I think definitely the audience will be able to kind of relate to their own context, because we're all kind of in the same little fish tank now, aren't we? So, I think that there are a lot of great suggestions and valuable insights. So thank you very much.
Yes,
my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, Mike, that was a good interview.
That was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Any important takeaways for you?
Well, I just liked how he made a distinction between teaching online and this idea of transferring, right? So kind of taking away or kind of removing that myth of that that all you do is transfer it online. And from what I heard was that we need to make a distinction, right? That we are now teaching online, and therefore we need to revisit our goals, right?
Yes.
And go back. And he didn't necessarily say go backwards, but rather we need to rethink our outcomes and shape our approach around the outcomes rather than just simply transferring, which I thought was very, very, very insightful.
I mean, the whole idea of having very clear outcomes, and I think goes back to how we design courses. If you just have courses that are designed with discrete item points as part of their learning outcomes, for example, students are going to be able to talk about the present perfect, or they can communicate using the simple past. Those are not very clear learning outcomes. And as he said, those outcomes have to be transferable. They have to be things that students can actually do outside the classroom. And also the roles that online teachers have. I think that to me was very interesting, because one of the things that I wanted to add to, he said, thinking about the tool, becoming familiarized with the tool. The second, the roles, right? The effective role of an online structure. And I was going to say the third one is related to what we said, Mike. The idea of vulnerability is just being yourself.
Right. If you don't know, you don't know. If you're having trouble, you're having trouble.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually, just hearing that from a leading expert is encouraging, right?
Yeah.
Because I think right now, from what I've gathered from our workshops that we've done, and is that that the teachers are kind of putting that added pressure, that added burden of wanting to be the expert in the technology. And of course, one should know as much about the technology, but you just can't be the be all and end all. And at some points, you just don't know. Just like when a grammar or language question comes up, you might need to just hit pause and revisit it at a later point. It was very interesting.
Yeah, no, overall, I think it was a very good interview. I hope everyone enjoyed it. And who are we interviewing next? Who's going to be next on our podcast? We don't know yet. We don't know, but
let us know also what you think of this format of 2 interviewers rather than just the one, because this was our first time, and we'd like to get your feedback on how that went as an audience member.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for listening. This is Teacher Talking Time podcast from Learn Your English. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to Teacher Talking Time, brought to you by Learn Your English. Ready to take control of your education? You're in the right place. Teaching, professional development, learning. Expand your world with Learn Your English.